So I really wanted to show you an example of how I can get different numbers of offspring based on parental traits, right? So if I were to say here that let's identify, is being metallic a dominant trait? And let's see if we can figure out. So notice, so she is steel, right? And we're going to look at the offspring um, that have these traits. And so if we look at their armor, color. So 20% or 20 of them or 100% of them have become steel. So, and when we look at them, right, they're all this steel color. Now, the dad we can't change, right? But it tells us he's non-metallic. So let's go ahead and manipulate the mother's alleles again. See how she has 2 chromosomes, one from her mom and one from her dad, that each have a copy of a gene. Now they can be different alleles of that gene. But let's go ahead and see. So now I've made both of hers non-metallic and her offspring are non-metallic. That makes sense. But let's see, is metallic a dominant trait? So in order to test that, what I've done is I've created metallic and non-metallic alleles in her genes, in her genetic makeup. And now what we can see is, let's look at their stats. 50% of them are metallic and 50% of them are non-metallic. And if we were to work through the Punnett square of doing a heterozygote crossed with a homozygous recessive organism, that's what we would expect to see. So now what I want you guys to think about is, if we were to create a mother and a father, right? So if we're to take the mother, here's her diploid cell that matches up in homologous pairs, right? And so we have to identify those homologous pairs, and I do that by size, okay? And if we were to create 4 haploid sex cells for her, we would go through this crazy duplication process, and then we would go into 4 sex cells with half the number of chromosomes that she originally started with. Then if we were to get a father to do the same thing, he's going to go through and create 4 sperm. So he starts with 6 chromosomes in his cell. He's now going to have 3 in his 4 sperm cells. And let's say that we choose this mother's egg and we look at the alleles, okay? So we see that this egg happens to have the allele for having 4 limbs and hind limbs. On here, she has the allele for no nose spike. And on here, she has the allele for non-metallic and no wings. So let's look at the father. Here's his allele for no nose spike, no forelimbs, no hind limbs, and non-metallic and wings. Let's go ahead and create this offspring. And that's going to happen as a result of fusing these 2 gametes together to form a zygote. That's fertilization. And so we're going to form these 2 together. And now this offspring is going to go be a result of the dominant traits being expressed. Notice this offspring has wings. Mother doesn't, the father does. So wings must be a dominant trait, okay? Also, no nose spike. He's non-metallic and no forelimbs, but notice this chromosome has the allele for forelimbs. So this one must be dominant. Same thing with hind limbs, okay? So it has an allele for hind limbs, and it has an allele for no hind limbs. So we see hind limbs present, so we must assume that hind limbs are dominant, okay? So that's going from, I'll go back to our notes packet here, right? That's going to be where we get from gametes to zygotes. So the haploid cells, so the gametes are the haploid cells. That fuse together to produce the single-celled zygote. So it's two cells coming together to form one. The male, it's smaller, and this is able to propel movement, and that's called the sperm. Female, she has a larger, passively moved, so it can't move on its own, it just moves as a result of other products, egg or ovum. So a zygote is the diploid cell. Remember, that's 2N. Produced when gametes fuse. You can see that here. But also, in my simulation here, I took my gamete, sperm, egg, and fused them to make one unique cell. So we have different combinations that can be made. If there are two alleles in a population, now this is different than saying in an individual, right? I'm saying there are two alleles possible in a population. So for example, pea flowers could either have the axial allele or the terminal allele. And so they can either get the possible diploid zygote with two heterozygous parents, could be big A, big A, big A, or little a, little a. Those are the only possible combinations that could be formed when you try and pair those things up. But if there are three alleles of a gene in the population, like blood type, for example, there are three alleles, type A, type B, and type O. Now we write blood type with this I before it, and I'll talk to you guys about that a little later why, but we use an I with a superscript for blood type, okay? So type A is written like this, IA, and it could be that you do IA, I, little I. Little I stands for O, and remember that blood type is simply the different versions of blood. So for example, type A, you might have alleles like this or proteins like this on the surface of your blood. Whereas type B, maybe you have alleles like this. I'm sorry, again, proteins like this on the surface of your blood cells. And then type O has nothing. So remember that type O is the universal donor, but it can only receive type O blood. Type A blood can only receive from type A or type O. Type B blood can receive from type B or type O, because the idea behind this is these antigens can't mix. But what you say to me, oh, and an antigen is just a surface protein, but what you say to me is, well, what about type AB, Mrs. Roper? Well, AB might be something like this. And AB can receive blood from anyone, but can only give to other ABs. Okay, now there's a lot more to blood type we're going to go over, but just so that we can talk about what it's like with three alleles in a population, you could have it where it looks like this, and we're going to do the Punnett squares to these, so don't worry, but it could be that you get IA, 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 IB, which that's type AB. You could get IA little I, that'd be type A. You could get type IB, IB, type IB little I, and then little I, little I. I want to be sure and be very clear here that even though we have 3 different alleles, and remember, there's lots of different allele possibilities, but if we have 3 alleles in a population, each individual still only has 2 alleles. Okay? So, that will wrap it up for possible allele combinations from gametes to zygotes. We'll go into much more depth on Punnett squares soon.